Hey everyone, James from TDB here, bringing you another Inbetweenisode. Today I am going to be talking about what tuition tea is and just talk a little bit about that as a concept. So you probably heard this term before. It's mentioned quite prominently if you look up some of the tea blogs, specifically Marshall, and I think he's probably the best tea blog at talking about different concepts such as this one. And I think you're going to find a couple different definitions depending on who you ask, but essentially I define it as tea that you regret buying. And the type of tuition that you're going to have is going to vary. So one tea could be tuition for one person, and for another person could be perfectly fine. So of course there's kind of a naturally subjective element to it as well. For instance, a lot of people's tuition is ripe that they end up buying early, and they realize the speed test, which is, in my opinion, kind of an essential measurement for determining if something is tuition. Speed test is essentially how quickly, how often, how frequently are you drinking that tea. And if it does not pass the speed test, that means you're basically not drinking it very much. And it also could mean that this tea ends up being tuition. So perfectly decent tea can end up being tuition. Sometimes tuition tea just sucks. I mean, that is also kind of an inherent reason why it could be tuition. But in many cases, it's a case of like a match fit, where the tea does not match well with the sorts of tea that you like to drink. So I use ripe as an example because for me, that is not the case. In fact, I can usually get away with buying like quite, if ripe is even average-ish, and I'm perfectly fine drinking it, usually because I can put it into just kind of my daily ripe grinder, which is basically 10 grams of ripe in the morning that I drink with my wife, and it doesn't need to be especially good. We're satisfied with something that's pretty mediocre, in my opinion. And so it'd have to be especially bad not to be able to be used in that context. So as a result, I can buy ripe fairly recklessly compared to other people, just because I know that it's not going to kind of wither away and die like other teas. Like one type of tea that I know would be a terrible idea for me to buy, like a 600 gram bag or something like that, would be Dansang, because it does not do well on my speed test, or like Taiwanese Baojiang, something like that. Even if I like the occasional session of it, it just doesn't make sense for me to buy. And so it would basically be some form of tuition or some sort of regret. Tuition is also inevitable. I think it's fine, and you shouldn't go too far out of your way to try it. It's good to push the limits and try certain things. Not every purchase is going to work out perfectly, and there's really no shame in it. I think it's a lot easier to avoid once you start to get experience, because then you start to know, okay, these are the keys for good teas. I like the teas from these types of vendors and whatnot. So it's kind of a natural thing where experience is going to help to eliminate a lot of the tuition. But, it's cool and interesting to try different sources. Sometimes that can be being the guinea pig. I like doing that sometimes as well, and just trying a new tea from a different vendor, and you just do start to get better at those sort of calculated risks the more experience that you do get. And yeah, the tuition is just going to vary a lot person to person. I have one friend who actually bought a tool of 2003 Wistaria Zupin and a 2005 Wistaria Zupin. In my opinion, pretty quality teas, and he ended up regarding them as tuition because he didn't care for them at all. And I luckily am friends with him and was able to get both of those teas from it. So, that seems like a very odd case of tuition. I think most people would find those teas pretty satisfying. But for him, they were not the teas for him, even though they are pretty good quality teas. Another thing that you're going to hear too, especially for people that are newer, is sometimes people are like, as a way to like justify not trying out the nicer teas or whatever, it's like they might say they taste the same. I find that this is rarely said by people that actually are experienced. Most people that are experienced aren't going to be like, there's no point in me trying this Bianhao Yiwu, because it's going to taste the same as this 2002 cheap Yiwu to me. Odds are it's not going to, and you should not use that as a rationalization to not try a certain tea. It's fine to not try a tea, but I find that excuse often to be a fairly cheap excuse that it is. I find it very rare for people who are like, this expensive tea is tuition in that sense. I'm sure some people will disagree with that, but that's just my personal feeling on the matter. In my opinion, too, a lot of tuition comes down to, or avoiding tuition is about buying lesser quantities. It's always good to limit the damage. It's one thing when you think a tea is going to be the tea for you, and you buy like a whole tongue of it, and then you realize, wait a second, that I regret that. That was kind of a mistake. So a lot of it is about buying less while you get that kind of accumulate slowly that experience that you're just going to naturally get as you dive into tea and explore different categories of tea. And so making sure you don't overbuy during that period, or if you do buy a bit more than you can handle, you can always trade it, especially if you know it's a tea that's sought after. If you're buying like random cheap ripes, then that's going to be a lot harder to trade than something like a high quality cake, even if you're trading like 20 grams of a high quality cake. One guy I've been introduced to in Discord bought a cake of Qingtang as his first, I think, was his first cake? One of his first cakes, and he basically used that as a bartering tool to basically try all kinds of different stuff. Because, why? Well, because Qingtang is a fairly sought after tea, and so it's easy to find people that are like, hey, there's only a cake size available of this, but I would like to try it. And so, yeah, I can easily exchange 15 grams of this for 10 grams of Qingtang or whatever it is. So yeah, don't overvalue value when sampling or when you're new too. I think there's a huge value in just terms of experience in just trying a lot of different teas. So whether that's trading, whether it's sampling a lot. So yeah, a lot of it, I think people overvalue value or price per quality when they're getting started, when really you should be most focused on what are the teas that are going to help me learn the most, rather than getting large quantities of teas before you really know the sorts of teas that you're going to end up liking in a couple of years or whatever. In my opinion, it's a lot better to have $20 on a great single session. $20 is a lot to spend on a session of tea, so you could get some very phenomenal tea, than $20 on a cake that you're only going to have once and ends up being just okay. So I think evaluating experience over price per quality is also something to really think about when we are thinking about tuition tea. And eventually, obviously price plays a factor in pretty much any tea purchase. Once you kind of have your feet under you, it's a lot easier to figure out what are the right value purchases to buy, because in the end, we have to drink that stuff. So you don't want to be buying just cheap stuff that is never going to pass the speed test, even if it's fantastic value. And in that same sense, I would say don't idealize your sort of tea retirement too early. I think sometimes pu'er in particular can have this kind of deck building aspect to it, where it's like, oh, I'm going to build this perfect thing, or Lego building or whatever. I'm going to build this perfect model of these teas that I'm going to drink, and then I'm just going to retire from my tea purchases in the year of 2026, and I will drink these teas, and maybe I'll move to a log cabin at some point where my teas will age wonderfully. They'll probably end up smelling like the logs. But anyways, the point being that you cannot, it's hard to imagine exactly what teas you're going to like. For instance, I never thought I would be such a prolific ripe pu'er drinker, but it happens to fit my lifestyle pretty well, and my wife likes it. So that ends up being a tea that is very, very easy to consume, and in some years has been my most consumed tea, as dull and boring as it often can be. So yeah, tuition is just going to be defined a little bit differently. Those are some different thoughts on it. Just scrolling through my notes, making sure I got everything. Yeah, I think that's everything. So thanks all for tuning in. Let me know how you like this episode. Let me know if you like these kind of random musings, and I will see y'all next time. Cheers.